So on the painting table today is my Death Guard Demon prints. Now this is the paint job. This is a part 2 video. Part 1 was the build, and I'll stick a link to that in the description down below. As ever, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Tell me what I'm doing well in the videos, tell me what I'm not. Still very early days, so any feedback is appreciated. As ever, I'm going to put all the paints I use in the description down below, so you can follow exactly if you like. If you want to do your own thing, great, go ahead and do that, and just take this as a bit of inspiration. So I've started off with a black spray, and like the rest of the Death Guard I've then done retributor armour over the top. I like that effect, and I'll talk about it in the other videos quite a lot. Death Guard green as your base coat. Put that down onto all the armour areas, being fairly consistent. 2 thin coats, all that kind of nonsense. And then moving on to bone effect. And as I've always said on the bone, start at the base, work your way up, because on the kind of living areas you very much can see those brush strokes. So what I'm doing now matches the Death Guard paint job I've already done for my troopers. So I will again link that in the description down below so you can check that out, because I spend a bit longer on all the basic steps than I do on this one, because this one's more about what I'm going to do at the end to do something different on him, because he's the main character. But similar thing. So I'm throwing down the rakarth flesh here into all the kind of fleshy, what would have been normal human skin areas, but I'm also using it on the tentacles, and I go into a little bit of wet blending, a bit more detail on my Death Guard troop paint job, because I get in a little bit closer, but essentially on all the fleshy areas. But then on the tentacles, you want the top half that touches the skin with rakarth flesh, the bottom half I'm using Screamer Pink, and I'm getting straight onto the same tentacle before the rakarth flesh dries, so that I can put the Screamer Pink kind of into that rakarth flesh before it's dried, and almost merge it and blend it together, kind of in the middle of the tentacle, so you get a 3-tone effect on that tentacle. So just some very quick wet blending. Okay, so I'm going on the models and doing that, and really it's play as you go with any of these models. You might decide that, there's a lot of flesh showing, a lot of tentacle showing, I want to do something different, and the beauty of Death Guard is it doesn't have to be consistent, and you can play as you go. The other thing to mention here is that I will obviously paint the little Nurgling that's on his base and various other bits with that pink, the maggots that I've got bursting out of his shoulder. Now, I'm not going to go through what I'm doing with the base as I'm going. I'm going to at some point do a basing video where I'll talk about that I use, I cast up detailed pieces to the base to tie the army together, and I will go through that later, but you'll see it obviously progress through this video as you go. Now his left shoulder, I kind of converted it with a bit of inspiration from The Mandalorian, really, hairy egg nest, that kind of thing. So just using a brown, using several browns here and a couple that I've mixed in between, doing leather all across the model, doing that kind of hair effect on the shoulder. And really you can mix the browns, you can do it all together. I would suggest if you're doing troopers that you use brown from a pot. It's a hell of a lot easier than mixing it together, but because I'm doing a character here, that's a little bit of difference, that I will mix the browns together, because I know I'm going to be able to keep it consistent on the model when I go back to it later, because it's not all going to dry out on the wet palette, because I'm just doing one kind of model. But that's just your approach. You can mix every time if you want, you can use a pot every time if you want. That's what I'm doing here. So I'm using the black and silver now, blackening up his side to make it look a bit more like the plague weapons that the normal plague troopers will have, and then just taking some of a silver colour to do any areas that I think I don't want to leave that kind of rusty brass effect. So some of the spikes, his chainsaw blades, and some detail around the model. And really you can do as much or as little as you like into that silver colour. It depends if you want like a rusted metal effect or if you want a dirty brass effect. That's up to you. So I'm throwing some yellow down now onto the pustules on his shoulder, and I'm also going to do this basically anywhere that I think in the future I'm going to put some of the Nurgles rot down. It's a good base coat for Nurgles rot. I really like the effect that Nurgles rot over the top of yellow has. Now, if you don't like that effect, you want to do a different colour, you could do these pustules blue, you could do them green, whatever colour you like, and it'll give you a different looking effect to what putting Nurgles rot over yellow has done. So I've hit every area that I'm going to use Nurgles rot into the yellow there, and then in between this off camera I've also painted the red areas on the fuel tanks and other pieces. Now we are going to do a wash stage in a minute, which seems a bit counterintuitive to do Nurgles rot before wash, because it will dull the Nurgles rot down, but I actually really like the effect that Nurgles rot, then a wash, then going back with Nurgles rot actually makes. Nurgles rot is a kind of a shinier, glossier finish, but dulling it down and bringing it back up I think will work really well. So there's all the base coats thrown down on the model. exactly as I've done in kind of other videos. And now we're going to do a wash layer. I'm using a Vallejo wash, a sepia one, that is a very dirty looking wash when it finally dries. Now, believe it or not, not all brown washes are the same. So you get a lot of really, really nice washes that would be inappropriate to use on certain stages of a model. You know, if you look at my other favourite wash, which is the Reichland Flesh Shade, for example, it's got a very pinky tone to it. So if you were to cover this model in Reichland Flesh Shade, it would suddenly have a pinky hue, which you wouldn't want. Or at least I wouldn't want for this. I want more of a dirty effect. So look, a wash is not a wash, is not a wash. You know, they all do different things and have different objectives to them. Now, I used this particular wash because I wanted it a real dirty effect and did the whole model. When I do other painting videos, if I want different tones to show through at different parts of the model, I wouldn't necessarily drown the entire model in the same wash. So just be careful when you're using it, but I've used a fairly thick coat. I'll leave it to dry for overnight, this was, and then you'll see now where the dirtiness is. Now you could stop here, and on basic troopers you might want to stop here, but bringing it up to the next level, like you've seen in my other videos, this is now going back with exactly the same colours we've used, but not covering every single part. So I'll talk about how I'm doing the bone now, because it applies to recovering every other section. You'll see I'm going back an awful lot to the bone on the wet palette, and I'm taking very, very little off there. So I'm kind of dragging it out from where the paint sits into a very thin layer onto that wet palette, and really taking minimal amounts of paint up off that wet palette onto the brush. And I'm going back to the same area of bone 10, 15, 20 times before I'm kind of happy. Now you could do it in, you know, one thick coat, but what you would do is you'd ruin all the layers you've done, and going back, starting at the raised areas where the sun would hit, and working gradually in towards where the shaded areas are and the deep recesses of the model, means you can cover up as much or as little as to what you've already done, and stop when you're happy with the effect. If you go in quite heavy, loads of paint in your brush, you can't, you're done. So when you're doing this layer after the wash, little and often is what I would say. Pre-wash, you know, a couple of coats, you know, 2 thin coats, you're done. Here you're probably talking 10, 20 coats, and this is over every colour you've already used. Start the raised area where the sunlight would hit, work your way in. Okay, so we've done that on the rest of the model in that kind of with the same colours we've already used. Now I'm showing you what I'm doing slightly differently with the demon prints that I've done with the rest of the Death Guard, because the rest of the Death Guard I've just done one colour on the armour, one colour everywhere else, and happy with that. Here's a character, I'm going to put a bit more effort in. So what we're almost doing is doing every single panel almost in the same wet blending effect that we've done with the Tentacles, for example. Starting off with the Death Guard green for all the raised areas, and then while the Death Guard green is still wet, I'm going back and going to a lighter green colour, which I've used on the wet palette there, which is the Elysian green. And you'll see that I'll work with some Death Guard green, put it onto the raised areas, work the way into the shade, but not hitting the really heavy shaded areas. Then drop in, take some of that lighter green, while the Death Guard green's still wet, stick that on the really raised areas, and it kind of blends the two colours together. It doesn't go all the way to making it as bright as the brighter colour you've used. Merges them together, gives that nice effect, and then you can go back, put some Death Guard green back on, shade down the areas that have gone a bit too bright or whatever. So you can see I'm dropping back to the previous panel and just playing with the two paints, but again, very little amounts of paint, back and forward till you're happy with the effect you've got to. So now going for the armour, using the retributor armour just to bring up the brass areas on not everywhere, but just certain areas where I think the sun's going to hit, certain areas where I think it'll look nice. And what I am doing on the demon prints, which I didn't do on the actual Death Guard troopers, is going back around and finding every single rivet, every single bolt, and all that kind of stuff on him to bring some of those details forward. On a smaller model, you miss a few bolts, it's not really going to stand out. This kind of model, you want to be quite careful. Now onto a wash stage. So I'm going with contrast Magos purple onto all the tubes and pipes. Not using this to Tentacles, because the Tentacles, we've done that wet blend effect like we said earlier. I'm doing it to tubes and pipes, and any of the skin that's showing through in the cracks of the armour. And again, just to put another multi-tone in there. Picking up some nihilakh oxide to go onto all the brass areas for the rivets. So although we've put rust and kind of dirt everywhere else, brass oxidises, doesn't rust. So we don't want it looking the same, and you want some different tones on different areas. Now you can use this paint as a wash. I'm not, I'm just putting it on some focused patches. Speaking of rust, again, taking up that rust paint, going on to some of the silver areas that we've done. Not every silver area, just ones where I think, yeah, okay, I want a bit of rust here. This would look nice, and just playing with how I want those effects. And then we'll go around and do the Nurgles rot again that we saw, and I'm dropping some Nurgles rot on the thing. Now, this is a basically finished model, but when I was doing the final it's done video, I noticed I've missed the bolts on the red fuel tank at the back, so I go back off camera and just finish that. But here's the finished model. I'm really happy with the paint job. Hope you guys like it. Again, if you do, great, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next video.